I just want to do God's will.
The kind of revolution that the world needs is a Christian revolution.
If you want a miracle, you've got to expect it to happen.
You are the recipients of God's grace and God's blessings, and you rejoice in that reality.
Welcome to Life Today. Live, we are live today, and I am here with a gentleman who deals with a lot of persecution around the world. He is the president of International Christian Concern, ICC, they call it. His name is Jeff King, and we're gonna take a little tour around the world. We're also going to discuss whether we should be concerned about some of the things that we are seeing here in our own country and in Western countries. Sometimes, I see posts from people talking about how they're being persecuted, and I go, wrong word, But the reality is there are some concerning things in our own country, and what do we need to look at? What do we need to be concerned about? But around the world, we do a lot of work here at Life Outreach International in some tough areas, not as tough as some others, frankly, but Christianity is under attack, and it's always been that way. There's nothing new here. But it is something that we need to be concerned about. It is always a matter of prayer, and I think we underestimate sometimes the significance and the power of prayer. So at the very least, you're going to get a nice long prayer list today. But it's also, I think, healthy to sometimes get a global perspective on the church, on the situation in the world, and our place in it. And the good news is God is still in control. Evil is out there in the world, but the darkness cannot withstand the light, and we are called to be the light. So we will be encouraged, even though we're going to talk about some tough things. There's also a devotional out that Jeff has written that is very interesting. It's called The Whisper. Looks just like this. It's a 30-day devotional. You can pick it up wherever you get books. And the interesting thing here, you look at the subtitle, Lessons of Renewal Whispered from the Prisons of the Persecuted. What can we learn from those who are being persecuted? Well, Paul wrote many of his letters in jail, so we might be able to learn a thing or two. So appreciate you being here. Chat is open. Hello, Judy. Anybody else out there watching live, you're welcome to be a part of the conversation if you're on a chat-enabled channel. And if you're watching in the replay, we always appreciate your comments. Just be nice. That's all I ask. Jeff, welcome to the program. Good to see you today.
Randy, good to be with you.
Give us just a brief, if you would, sketch of ICC, how you started and what you guys are doing, just to give a little background.
Yeah, so I'll just say there's kind of three legs to the stool of ICC, and they all start with an A. And so the first thing is we do assistance. So we're overseas dealing with victims of real persecution, you were referencing, but real persecution, the heavy stuff. And so we do a whole bunch of bandaging, as you can imagine, and that's victims, that's families. If a pastor's killed, we take care of the family. Buildings, we repair buildings, but then we do a whole lot of building too. So we that's the bandaging. We build the church on the margin, the toughest places in the world, and that can mean pushing out the scriptures, sending out underground pastors, or pushing the gospel into North Korea. And then we do awareness, a whole bunch of work like this, and trying to wake the church to know what's going on with the persecuted. And the last thing we do is advocacy, and we work on Capitol Hill with senators and congressional representatives and the State Department, and sometimes the administration, depending on who's in there.
No comment. So you've been doing this since 2003 full time. What have you seen over the last 2 decades? Is it same story, different places, or is it trending one direction or another? Just overall, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I'd say, first of all, I think the big lesson when you pull back is, look, persecution used to really be a story of the old Marxist countries, and they're dying off. Now, we still have big cases. We've still got Cuba. We've still got China. So it's still going on, some different places, Nicaragua. But the big shift is, Randy, when the money of the world started to flow into the Middle East, starting with the 70s. And you go back, you remember the oil shocks, and so oil wealth exploded, and the Saudis and the Qataris found themselves with a war chest they just couldn't imagine. And they used that money to radicalize the world's Muslims. They built mosques at a furious pace and installed Wahhabi radicalized mullahs in there for us, a pastor. And then they invested in madrasas, boarding schools that are little jihad factories and turning out people that are not very well educated but ready to go to war. They funded terrorist groups, on and on and on, radicalized theology schools. So what we're seeing today is really the rise of all that money that was seeded into the ground for decades. And it goes beyond persecution. So persecution is very much now the story of radical Islam, but it's also in the terror groups and this thing. We started to see the terror groups, rise up in the 80s and the 90s, and we're like, what is going on? It's all the same root.
Interesting. We know that the radical Muslims, I guess the proper phrase, they hate Israel. They want to wipe it off the map, right? There's been things in former Soviet satellite countries where they're trying to, get the Soviets out. And from our perspective, you kind of go, yeah, I get that. Of course, the Shiites and the Sunnis fight as they always have. What do you think their goal is? Are they targeting Christians because they're kind of in their way, or is there some direct connection between the rise of these terror groups and Christianity?
Yeah, so you could answer on a couple different levels, but I think if you really draw back, and the biggest lesson is that, look, Islam has always conquered by the sword. What's on the flag of the Saudis? It's always Muhammad, for the first 10 years of his ministry, he started having, you could call them different things, spells. He wasn't sure what these things, something was happening to him. And he goes back to his wife and he's like, I don't know what's going on with me, but a demon, I might, be infested with a demon. She says, no, you're a prophet. These are visions from God, and you're a leader. And so for the next 10 years, he tries to build a religion, and he doesn't get very far. And after 10 years, he says, Allah has given me a new message, and that is that we can conquer by the sword. Those who oppose us, we can attack them. So at that point, hey, everybody, come join me. And anybody who opposes us, we can go attack them. We can steal their unbelievably wealthy homes. We can take their wives and their daughters and do with them whatever we will and steal all their money. Well, who do you think that attracted? And what do you think happened to the religion after that? So that's very politically incorrect, 100% accurate in terms of Muslim history. They don't try to hide that. That's in the Quran. That's the Hadiths. That's the story of what happened to Muhammad. And then they conquered by the sword. They first took over Saudi Arabia, and then they spread out from there, and they went all the way into India. And you can read the accounts of the caliphs that were going out and murdering, and especially in India, they were just untold bloodshed. So in the end, this is Islam. And in the end, they hate Christians and Jews. The Jews were mocking Muhammad back in the day. Really, it really goes back to that, apart from the spiritual. But when he was trying to form his religion in those early days before the sword, he kind of joined Judaism, Christianity, and the pagan religion of the day. And so when he started saying things biblically, he was laughed at by the Jews. And so he had a special hatred then for the Jews and started attacking them. But with the Christians, it's, look, we stand in the way and we say Jesus is the only way. And so we have to be defeated. And plus we stand up for Israel. So that makes us a political enemy as well.
Yeah, it does. Have you been as, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but have you been as surprised as I have since October 6th at the pro-Hamas and some of the radical, it just looks like radical Islam in our own country?
Yeah. There is a fascinating story behind that. So, being in my business years ago, I had to solve the question for myself and answer the question for myself. What is radical Islam? What's going on? And then I was seeing a lot of Saudi funding of schools, and I was like, what are they trying to get at? So it's an interesting story, but the Saudis, the Middle East studies programs in the top schools in the country, they were started by the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies in the 50s. because we had a lack of knowledge about this region of the world, and they wanted to create scholars that could be relied on and could advise them of what to do. And so they started Middle East studies programs in the top schools around the country. Well, again, go back to that influx of the world's money in the oil wealth in the 70s. They started to take over the Middle East studies programs in the top schools. For the last decade, it goes back farther than this, but for the last decade, they have been funding the top 100 schools at the rate of $1 billion $1 billion per year. And a lot of it flows into the Middle East studies program. So Randy, when you give $1 billion a year, you get a bit of influence with that. and when you say, gosh, I think this is such a great teacher, wouldn't he be great at your university? And those administrators are going to be like, yes, sir, he would be wonderful. I don't particularly like his ideology. Gosh, he's out there. But anyways, let's keep them happy. And so you can have great influence on what's taught, who's teaching it. And those Middle East studies programs, for the most part, have been lost, and they've been radicalized. So when you see Hamas go in and slaughter over 1,000 people in Israel, and rape and pillage, and then all of a sudden you see all these tent cities go up at the top schools in the country, and they're all kind of the same color tents, and they have the same placards and the same phrases
right.
and the same interviews and the same phraseology. Well, follow the money. We all love that phrase, follow the money, and that's where it leads. And the schools are hiding it illegally.
I actually saw a report recently that another country has surpassed Saudi Arabia, if this report is accurate, and that's Qatar.
Yeah, Saudi and Qatar are the top two Middle East ones. China's the third. They have a different agenda, but it's all the same. You're buying influence, and it kind of goes back. I mean, and the amount of money that flows into Washington, and the congressional leaders, the senators and congressional leaders, and they're buying influence, and it's a major problem. And this is what happens in a democracy when you can buy influence. And it kind of goes back. One of my favorite phrases is democracy is a terrible form of government. It's just better than all the rest.
It's the least terrible of them all, right?
It's the least terrible of all of them.
Yeah, no, I think that almost every 4 years.
That's right.
The least worst of what am I doing?
That's right.
But you know what? You say the least worst, and the worst is getting really bad these days. And when they're our enemies are buying our education. I don't know. I'm looking at it now, and all my kids went to state universities. They grew up in public school here in Texas.
Yeah,
I felt pretty good about that. But it just seems like every year I go, get your kids out of the schools because they're indoctrination camps.
It's oh my gosh. Well, I'm in D.C., right, and I'm in Maryland. You can just imagine what's going on, and it's indoctrination. It's like the school system is so corrupt ideologically, and they're so far gone. Apart from, is it a healthy environment? Do you want them exposed to safety wise? So I think that's part of the thing. We've got to get the kids out of the schools, let go of the income, teach your kids at home if you can, in a homeschool program, get them into a program, but it's tough. Not everyone can do it. There's just circumstances. If you're a single mom, how do you pull that off?
Yeah, no doubt. But I will say this, with the rise of the internet and what people went through with COVID,
yes,
the online curriculums,
of course,
curricula, I think plural, are phenomenal these days.
Yeah,
it is. If someone's interested, just do some research. You will find, and
you will.
So it's good. Okay. I also, side note, and we're not going to talk about this, but I've seen some of the clashes in Pride Month with the pro-Hamas groups in the streets. So I'm like, you put the Alphabet Plus group in the streets with these pro-Hamas people, and it's going to be a wake-up call. It's a weird world we live in.
It is a weird world.
Okay.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend, but oh my gosh.
Yeah,
If you're a Pride believer, that you better stay away from that crowd. They will throw you off the top of the building.
I know. I mean, it's almost like the 1930s in Germany, where you got the socialists and the communists fighting in the streets, and you're standing back going, I don't know if I like either one of these guys. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the book, The Whisper. Yeah. Tell us where you're going in this, and what people are going to see, because this is unique. This is not your typical devotional kind of book.
It's not. Well, Randy, I was called to ICC through the means of a miraculous dream. I won't get into it, but it was the Lord. It was miraculous. And I land at ICC, and I'm getting familiar with what's going on around the world by going through the files. And what I see there is just beyond description. It's just the worst of the worst. And right then there was a multi-year jihad going on in Indonesia. And it's just a horror show and beheadings and everything. My wiring is I'm really an evangelist. I want to call the dead to life. I want to call the living to the deep. And I'm like, Lord, why did you call me to persecution? Because it's very hard, and a lot of people can't handle it. They're not interested because it's hard stuff. And then I go to China, and I ask for a meeting with pastors who have been in prison for long sentences. And I spent an afternoon with some pastors that had, the lightest sentence was 10 years in a concentration camp. The longest was 24. And I asked them, I said, tell me about persecution. They said, persecution is a gift. They said, it's not one you'd ever want.
No.
And that's what I did. When they told me this, just when you fold your hands, that's what I'm like, persecution is a gift. We don't want it. We would never give it, but it's a gift because it makes us dependent on the Lord, and it breaks down our self-strength and our self-dependence. And that's our problem. I said, I spent an afternoon with them, but here's one of the most shocking things. They said, I said, what's your biggest worry? And they said, our biggest worry is that the pastors, the younger pastors coming up after us that we're mentoring, they haven't been hunted and tortured, imprisoned, and murdered like we were. They said, that's our biggest worry. I go back, and this is rattling around my brain. And the whole time, this early first year of when I joined Crusade, the Lord calls me in with this miraculous dream, and he's whispering to me over and over. There's no mistaking this message. I want you to learn the lessons of the persecuted and the martyrs, and I want you to shout it to the world. It's not for you. I want you to shout it to the world. All right, Lord, let's go. Here we go. I'll figure this out quickly. And well, I come back from China, and then it probably 10 years I'm trying to understand what am I supposed to communicate, and why persecution? But then I began to see something. And if I had to sum it up, I'd say I used to think that the suffering they go through was of a particular nature, and it is in the intensity. It can be horrific, but suffering is universal. And I saw what the suffering did to the persecuted church. They were the deepest believers, the most devoted. They suffered the most, but they grew the fastest. They loved the Lord the most. And then I said, it's the suffering that's so key, and suffering is universal. They spend time in prison for printing Bibles, spreading Bibles, and discipling. We spend time in the prisons of depression and anxiety and divorce and bankruptcy. And so anyways, I saw this lesson. I saw that suffering was not a destination. It's a door to transformation. And that would sum up one of the real core messages in the devotion. And it's really, I take those messages I've learned from the persecuted, and I'm shouting them, but I do it through stories. So it's a devotional with 30 different stories with these lessons built into it.
I think it's a mercy, honestly, from God, that we can learn the lessons that the persecuted have learned without having to be persecuted.
It is a mercy, yes.
And I think it's great that we do that. One of the books that I read, earliest books I read as a kid, was Through Gates of Splendor, Jim Elizabeth Elliot. And that really spoke to me, and probably laid an early foundation for, why I do what I do today. And so it is possible. I've never suffered like they have suffered. I mean, the worst I've been is, detained. Granted, they looked like teenagers with machine guns, but they weren't pointed at me. They were at their sides, and we were detained for about an hour. And are
you able to say which country, by the way?
That was in Mozambique. Mozambique, and it was a shakedown. It was just a shakedown.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, and that doesn't even it didn't even register on the blip of persecution, So to be able to read a book, like The Whisper, and get the insight without having to go through the hard stuff. It's like reading one of Paul's letters from jail, where you can learn his lessons about being content without having to actually be in the jail. It's to me, it's mercy. It's a gift, and so I appreciate that. I would like to, if we can, in our short time I got left, because I could talk about this all day. I'd like to get a little bit of a rundown so people get an idea of some of the things. We see in the news Christians being attacked in villages in Nigeria. It's going on in northern Mozambique right now. Mm-hmm. There's a few places and stories that I think people don't know about. In fact, I want to show people the website. This is persecution.org. And if you go there and you scroll down, you will see some of the items from their newsroom. And I just recommend that people, check that out, because we live in such a news insulation here in the United States. It's kind of weird at times, frankly. We're such a bubble. But one story I didn't know, and I'm wondering if there's an update. There's a pastor in Malaysia, Raymond Coe, who's been missing. Is there any update, and what is the story on him?
You know what? I don't have that granular detail.
Okay.
So now I got to go get that. I can speak bigger picture. So within Malaysia, it's a Muslim country. You've got a large Chinese minority that's largely Christian, and they are oppressed. All kinds of games politically to keep them in their place and to keep them from gaining power, even though of course, it's the Chinese. They're the hardest working and most industrious and very wealthy because of that. So that's the dynamic that goes on that's the broad background to Malaysia. Okay. And so the government has gotten more radicalized over the years. And yet the gospel's going out, and they're gonna fight that. So,
yeah, we see it in other Muslim-controlled countries. In Pakistan, there's a Christian was attacked for blasphemy. One of the stories on the news site.
You bet.
Myanmar, Christians are detained by the military. Of course, in India, which I think a lot of people know, especially in India's large, right? And so there are variations within the country, but there are anti-conversion laws. Preaching the gospel, you can be targeted, you can be jailed, whatever. In that situation, one that surprised me is that there are pastors being detained, and this is a little bit of a small story. That this is very targeted, but there's some issues in Nicaragua.
Absolutely.
So I don't know. Is the world trending in such a direction that there are more dangerous countries than there used to be, or is it just kind of a shift outside the Muslim areas?
Yeah, well, and Nicaragua is one of those old Marxist countries, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so that's really the driver there. So they persecuted the Catholics for decades, and the Catholics were also the Central and South American priests were very involved in social revolution too.
Yeah.
So an uprising and justice. So that they do not like, and they clearly see the Catholics as an enemy. Well, the Christians had been doing a lot of good work there, and the evangelicals weren't interested in any kind of power, and they did a lot of work for the poor.
Yeah.
And they were like, wow, these guys would be a good counterweight to these Catholic people we hate so much. And so they kind of let them go to the point and there was one particular ministry, but the evangelicals they were given free reign because of that dynamic I just spelled out by the government. And they started having public gatherings. Well, it culminated in one in the capital, in the central square of the capital. 300,000 Christians, I think, gathered. And that's when the government said, oh my gosh, we have a problem. And because the Marxists, look, they can't survive. The only way they survive is by bullet, by blade, and by bars. And so they are completely threatened by any kind of centralizing force, any kind of a thing that could grow into a political threat. So that's when they really started going after the evangelicals recently.
Well, yeah. Wait till the Marxists find out that most Catholics and Protestants love the same Jesus. That could be trouble.
I think they figured that out. They were like, darn, we thought the evangelicals might be the answer. It's like, nope, we don't like any of these people.
No. All right, last question for you, because you have
Yes, sir.
testified in front of Congress on religious freedom. What are you seeing in our country, and should we be concerned?
Yeah, we should definitely be concerned. It's still early days. So as you pointed out, it doesn't match what we see overseas, but that doesn't matter. It's the trajectory we're seeing.
Yeah.
And here's kind of a simple statement that I use to try to wake people up. Overseas, here's what happens. Here's what a leader says. Hey, we have religious freedom. And one side of his mouth, and the other side of his mouth, he says, what that means is, as long as you don't share your faith, share Bibles, or congregate together, as long as you keep it to yourself and stay in your little box in an apartment, we're all good. We have religious freedom. If you come into the public square, and if you're vocal at all or stand out, we're coming after you. Now, that rough description, does that sound a little familiar with what's going on? It's that we are in the public square. So anybody who is the nail that stands out gets hammered. That's what's going on in the public square. We're getting canceled, getting pushed out, and there's too much Niceanity. So our job is to be nice. If we stray from that, if we get into the gospel, we get hammered. If we make statements that are antagonistic to the LGBTQ community or whatever, if they feel that way, we get hammered. So again, they're push them out of the public square, punish them, take their businesses, fine them, put them in prison, all that. That's what happens overseas. That's the beginning of what we're starting to see here.
Well, I don't want to make this a political rant, but clearly when the number 3 guy or number 4 from the Department of Justice leaves the Department of Justice to go to a state in order to go after Trump, who's running against Biden, I think a lot of people look at that and go, that smells like the weaponization of the judicial system. Okay, and that's one thing in the presidential arena. Here's my concern. I'm seeing the same thing when they're going after pro-lifers.
Yes.
And Christians that stand up against the LGBTQ plus agenda, the trans agenda, things like that. Am I imagining this, or is this
You are
isolated?
not, sir. You are not. No, and it's all the same. And these banana republic tactics, this is the sad thing, and it's really the downfall of the republic. Because once you take the levers of government and use them and take them over and use them to go against your political enemies, it's like, oh my gosh, we're really far gone. Mm-hmm. And if there's a couple lessons, it's one, I always go back to this, and this isn't a political lesson. This is a spiritual one. It's like, we are part of the reason we are in the pickle we're in is because we have drifted. What did Jesus tell us to do? To win the whole world, go out and win, bring them to Christ, disciple them.
Yeah.
Now, how many churches have you been in, or do you know that are actually doing that rather than talking about it? That are training their people, then taking them out evangelizing, and then showing them how to disciple. I can tell you, I've been in a lot of churches over the decades. There's some that talk a good game, and very, very, very few that do that. So if we would just go out and follow what Jesus told us to do, that would really be the big thing. The other one is pray for revival. The third is run for office. The fourth is, if you can't run, show up to your school board meetings, any kind of county meetings, show up and speak up. Mm-hmm. That's the simple primer. It's like, you're not imagining it. You are a frog. You are in a very warm bath, and there's bubbles coming up all around you, and it's not a bath.
No, it's not. And, I absolutely advocate for voting, and especially, even more important than voting, frankly, more impact is running for local office, because that's where we've lost a lot of ground, is in the localities.
That's it, yeah.
But at the same time, we can do both. What you're talking about with the evangelization and the discipleship, some of the political stuff is a little short term, because you can get somebody in office and things can move in the right direction. Then you lose the office, things move drastically. That pendulum goes back and forth. But the evangelism and discipleship is a long term strategy
Yes.
that will change a culture, and it won't be overnight. And I think that's where a lot of Americans get frustrated. They want the quick change. I want to go vote one time and walk away, and everything's good. And the reality is that's just not biblical.
Yes.
We got to do the hard work of reaching the lost for Christ and training them up in Christ. You're 100%.
And Randy, part of what they want, you talk about that quick fix, part of what they want is I want things to go back to the way they were, where I was nice and comfortable in my culture. And it's like, that's not what the Lord called us to. We are in the lifeboat. The Titanic has gone down. We're in the lifeboat, and all around you are the dying. They're holding on to a life preserver and they're going under. And we're caught up in materialism and distraction. We're distracted. What did the Lord tell us to do? We need to grab hold of the Lord, the Holy Spirit, to live off his power and to go spill that into other lives.
So, last note of this discussion. Are you hopeful?
I'm always hopeful. And so this is so fascinating. Randy, you can imagine, like I told you how it started with me in persecution, opening up those files.
Yeah.
You do 20 years of persecution ministry, and that'll wear on you, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I was discouraged for a long time because I'm like, I know I'm a student of Scripture. I'm a student of prophecy. I know the Lord wins in the end.
Mm-hmm.
But how? We are sheep among wolves. And that's not a surprise to the Lord. As you said, there's nothing new under the sun. And after a while, I saw the sweep of history. I saw the sweep of church history, and I saw the dynamic of how persecution works, and it works in his favor. And it consumes the very satanic forces that are trying to crush the church. It sweeps them away. Look at Iran.
Oh, yeah.
The mullahs took over. The ayatollahs took over. They raped and murdered and pillaged in the church. They destroyed the leadership, tortured. Today, what is the fastest growing church in the world, Randy? You know.
Yeah. And it's Iran or China. I've heard both.
It's Iran in terms of percentages. And if you go to the mosques, they're empty. If you go to the churches, they're full.
Oh, wow.
The scripture teaches us, you look in the scriptures and the prophecies, and it said Iran in the last days would come, it would come to the Lord. And you're seeing it. How did it come? Through persecution. So am I hopeful? Nothing new under the sun. We've been through much worse. But stop. We can't, politics isn't our goal. Revival and being close to the Lord and evangelism, discipleship, these are our goals. Everything else flows from that. And we have to start with, I'm sick and tired, not of the politics, but of the wickedness of my own heart and of our nation. We must have holiness, and I cry out to the Lord.
Well said. Well said. And I think that's a good perspective. So I appreciate you, Jeff King. Is there anything from ICC or the book that you want to mention before I let you go? I want to make sure people are aware of.
Yeah, well, I would say go to persecution.org, sign up we have a magazine on persecution. And then also, if you don't have it in the notes, we'll get that to you. But there's a free book. I've got a free book for people. Yeah. Last Words of the Martyrs. You can put that in the show notes, so anybody can go and sign up. Just give us your address, and it's kind of the one before the Whisper. A lot of the same type of material, the spiritual lessons. And
the title of that again?
Last Words of the Martyrs.
Last Words of the Martyrs. Yes, that was in the notes. That free ebook. If you want to get that, you can go to persecution.org. And they will send that to you free, I guess, in a PDF kind of Word doc or something.
It's an actual book. So you'll have
the actual book.
Yeah, in the notes, you'll have the website to go to. And if you post it in the show notes, they can go and get a free copy of the book.
Okay, yeah, I'll look for that. Appreciate you, man. Appreciate the work you're doing.
Yeah,
and
you too. Enjoyed it.
I appreciate the heart, because it's one thing to inform people, which is good. It's another thing to fight on the political front, which is good. But when your core is evangelism, and I think that's where your compass is pointing in the right direction. So appreciate that.
You betcha. Thank you, brother.
Thank you guys for watching. Hit that share button. Let other people know what's going on. And if you haven't liked, followed, or subscribed, please do that. You'll get notifications of more conversations, some encouragement, some information, occasional controversy. I'm working on getting some controversial ones in here this summer. See, we'll have some fun. And check out The Whisper. It's available wherever you get books right now. We'll see you next time on Life Today Live.
Nobody can prevent you from doing the will of God.
Thank you, Randy.